Aaron, thank you so much for jumping on this show and this episode. I'm really excited for this conversation. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, mate. Thank you. It's good to be here.
So we were just having a bit preamble about your recent paper that was all around essentially mental skills integration in teams, but we'll get on to that. I'd like to just start the conversation just giving people a little bit of your background of sort of your own world in sport, and then also where you're at now and the people that you're working with. So my friend, start wherever you want to start with that one.
Yeah, pretty just a real love for sport. Probably I can't remember not loving sport. So I grew up in a very sporting family. My grandfather was president of the rugby club. Then my father became the president of the rugby club. So it was sort of inbred into me. In the region I lived in were a lot of good athletes. So I come from Hawke's Bay, which has some quite nice weather. So you got really good, strong, fast athletes. So yeah, I played everything. I honestly can't remember a time, even now, like I'm 47 this month, I just love sport. I love competition. I love everything associated with it, all the difficulties and the things you have to overcome. I just think it's an amazing microcosm of life that, and just to get the privilege, honestly, for me, of working in it every day. So had some really different experiences. So across lots of different sports, and then also with both teams that were wildly successful and teams that were absolutely horrible. So sort of you get the full gamut once you've been in it as long as I have, because you get these special occasions where things just come together and your team is just rolling, and then you'll get times where you don't think you'll ever see another win again. So I suppose that's part of the massive attraction for me. I know it's not for everyone, but the idea that every week is judgment day, and you're going to test and see how good you are, and then you got to go again and either keep something moving that's going well or pick stuff up off the ground after it's been broken a little bit. Like that, to me, is probably the most invigorating and the most fun part of what I get to do.
What brought about your sort of love for the mental side of the game, of sport?
Probably my own frustration,
Really?
Yeah, I suppose just being, pretty decent athlete growing up, and then not really knowing how to translate what I thought I was like, probably one way of saying is didn't translate potential into performance, and had a capacity or capability that was, I thought was pretty decent, but because of, say, pressure or not understanding the mental side, because there's nothing like it when I was growing up, it's sort of what it meant was that I had this great frustration, but no answers. And that was probably what motivated me to get into the work, was that I kept on coming across people who are obviously playing at a much higher level than I ever did, but they were experiencing the same frustrations. And, why do I prepare well? Why do I do all the things, tick all the boxes? Why do I go to the gym? Why do I do all my skill work? And then I get out there, and once the lights turn on, it feels like all those behaviors are now foreign to me, and I can't, actualize or grab hold of what I think I'm doing. And so for me, probably the personal side of it is one of the biggest frustrations you ever watch if you've worked in sports for a decent amount of time, is people who just don't actualize or realize their potential. And, or people that work incredibly hard, and you see how hard they work, how much it means to them. And we never get to see the best of them because they can't, maneuver through the mental demands of the sport. So that was probably more the, why I sort of got into that side of it. It was intriguing, and I was probably brought up in an era where you either had it or you didn't from the mental side. That was sort of the conclusion, like, that guy's good mentally, that guy's rubbish mentally. And it was seen as more of a personality-driven performance aspect rather than what I think it is. It's a skill. And then if you're not working on a skill, you're not going to grow it. So, and that's probably where the mental side is starting to grow, I reckon, a lot more now, where we're seeing it primarily used to increase someone's capability rather than an ambulance at the bottom of the hill for someone's failing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's even in a previous episode with Mustafa Sarkar, who's a lot of his research was around resilience, we spoke about how people can easily get labeled as just not being resilient.
Yeah.
And that's actually, he even spoke about how people may not show resilience in certain environments, but they'll show it in others. So I gave a really easy example for me was the fact that if anyone saw me in school when I was in maths, I'd have been labelled as very non-resilient. But if they saw me in sport, in cricket, they would label me as resilient and everything around sport. So the environment was the thing that brought out certain mental skills. But the idea that resilience is a skill that you develop, and this is what we're talking about. And
you tend to have more energy to develop resilience if you love where resilience is needed.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's just placing.
So if you need to be resilient to play a sport and you love the sport, you're going to work out a way to become resilient. But as you said, like if it's something you don't have a lot of care or passion or love for, then all right, that's what. And I don't know if he went into it in his research, but I think there's a real interesting parallel between love for what you're doing and equals the ability to be more resilient.
Yeah, I think there's bits around motivation, the motivation levels, and the intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, and the how autonomous people are towards what they do, and resilience. That essentially, if you love it more, you'll try harder. But how did you? How did you start working with teams? How did you start working with athletes? Was it just a putting yourself out there, or was it started in conversations? And
no, it's just I think all of my work throughout my career has always been relationally based. So like I was thinking about this the other day. I don't think I've ever applied for a job. I was thinking about that, like, because I had to send my CV in for another bit of work I'm doing, and I'm like, I don't even know if I have a CV.
Yeah.
It was more for the board to approve, but it was just I suppose I've never actively sought work, or it's always been through relationships, and then obviously word of mouth, and those sort of things begin to grow and develop, and you sort of find yourself into these sort of roles. And I think in sports, it's particularly high performance. It's kind of a sort of an unfair world, and sometimes like the rich get richer. But how do you get into that wealth? If you know what I mean? Like if you do good work and your team goes well, then you have heaps and heaps of opportunities. But then what do you do if you're just at the beginning of the journey? And, I think everybody needs a break somewhere along the line. You get lucky, or I don't know, people don't like to use that term, but I think there's a bit of, there's certainly a bit in there where you have to put it down to simple luck. Yeah. Like you happen to be in the right place at the right time, and the team was ready for what you were bringing to the table, and it made a difference. I think that's sort of an underestimated part of it. Like, I think of everyone that I've admired and followed over the years, someone got a break somewhere along the line, and they took the opportunity, which is awesome. Yeah. But I think it's a difficult world to get into, and and I think particularly with young practitioners, the understanding that you're not going to go from university to international sport, and like but there isn't really a defined pathway, particularly in the mental side of performance. It's, well, where do you start? I mean, I probably get 10 or 20 messages a week through Twitter or LinkedIn from young aspiring, professionals going, where do I start? And it's like, unfortunately, probably have to volunteer somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind
really
of like
sucks. Just done, a 5-year degree and spent X number of money, and your first sort of assignment is, well, you got to go volunteer at your local club that pays nothing. Maybe get a, packet of chips and a bottle of Coke afterwards. But I suppose that's just the reality of the industry.
But I've also heard you talk about how you're very practical in how you do things. You've recently delved into a lot more literature and the research, but previous I'd heard you speak about how you were more practical in your approach. But that's like, you could transfer that idea into an athlete, right? Like you got to do your groundwork to get where you are. So whether that is really early on and you're using your experience, but there's nothing wrong with doing something that you want to do for a long time, and just having the first early years and really sort of grinding out. I think when I was speaking to someone the other day about when I gave keynotes, when I first started giving keynotes just after my retirement, all right, I was 26, but I went straight into it, giving keynotes. I didn't step into a room and say, right, I want to command thousands of pounds here. I literally do it for free. I literally do it to anyone that would listen. And then it's gradually grown over time. And then more and more people come in. And it's just building up that wealth of experience, I guess. But moving on to you working with an athlete. So one thing I'm interested, you for listeners, you are literally the other side of the world right now. So I'm in the UK, you're in New Zealand. What are you seeing in sport, just I'd say over the last 3 years, that you would potentially be addressing more right now in athletes? If you could categorize it, if you could maybe theme it, is there a theme that you are addressing more than you ever have, or you're having to put more into at the moment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't actually know if there's anything that sort of sticks out as far as, but there's definitely trends that are generational, which have to do with the athletes now that probably weren't there. So I'll give you, say, 2 or 3 examples. Is like athletes need to play for a coach who cares for them. And like that, it's not transactional coaching, for example, or the old gaffer barking out demands, treating people with a little bit of disdain to keep them uncomfortable is so archaic and so gone. So, like the whole idea of personal connection as a performance enhancer is massive. Another thing would be that someone's experience in the environment would be the major factor on who they play for rather than loyalty to a jersey. So the idea that you could endure, idiot coaches or environments you didn't enjoy because you had to somehow have this, commitment to the jersey, I think that's gone, for example. I don't think we see how many players shift and lose potentially hundreds of thousands of pounds because the environment is so unenjoyable. Probably another thing would be that social media has created interesting narratives for athletes. So, what do they do with their social media interaction, where many of them need to use it to, meet the needs or the demands of sponsors, or it's a way for them to express what they're up to with families and friends who aren't around them, but yet it's a pretty loud voice and it can be pretty ugly. Then I suppose the other thing, just to sort of round it out, would be they are not willing to sacrifice their well-being on the altar of performance. And that's probably something that's quite different from previous years, where your well-being was certainly put down the list and you just did what you needed to do to be able to perform. I think athletes are much more aware of sustainability around performance now than they maybe were. I want to be able to do this for 10, 12, 13, 14 years. Therefore, I have to find a rhythm that helps me, mentally, emotionally, spiritually be well before, that's a priority. Whereas, we know probably, I'm a bit older growing up, where guys just wreck themselves in the name of performance on and off the field, and their personal well-being was seen as something, well, why would you worry about that? You just got a job to do. Well, that's completely different now.
I guess also social media has brought about stories that we're seeing now of people after their careers, and that then gives people the foresight of going, well, I really don't want that for myself. I think even in cricket, a big part of when I retired from the game professionally, a big part of my decision was, okay, my spine is broken. I have choices to do this, this, and this, but they're very extreme choices that are potentially that they will impact my life down the line. And I had seen many athletes that had these things to eke out months, maybe a few years of a career, but at the expense of hitting their 50s and think maybe having to have resurgeries and all sorts of things. And for me, having seen those stories, that made my decision or listening to the advice a little bit easier. But I think if I hadn't seen those stories, then I might have just jumped straight into it and gone, get this done, fix, and and then the repercussions down the line. But from a well-being point of view, we probably don't need another story right now. of people coming out and struggling from transitioning out, or the.
And it's a difficult one because, as much as I know, when you're playing and you have your PD time, you probably don't use it very well because it just doesn't feel relevant in that moment. And, the number of stories of guys coming back and speaking to younger players saying, I wish I had actually used the PD time, my personal development time, to set up a career or to buy some houses or to educate myself. I think there's quite a few of them now are going, man, I got to nail this stuff too.
Do you address that in your work? What would you, and if you do, what do you advise athletes who are so focused on their sport and maybe not giving themselves time to develop things outside of their sport?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging one because, as you know, at the highest level, it requires pretty much everything you got. So it's just knowing, okay, when I'm at the field or training or playing, I have to be 100% on and I have to be 100% committed. But I find those with hobbies or interests or, work experiences that they do within their career tend to have a much more balanced approach to their career. And, I think, what we have, I think it's kind of cool. Like we have a lot of guys that we have, on a day off, we have, I think 12 to 16 guys who go play golf. And that's healthy. Like it's awesome for them. They get out, they get with each other, do something different. But as far as the professional development side, I think it's, like I imagine you're a classic case is you don't see it until it's too late.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, shoot. Now that's why that was really important. And in some senses, I'm not that interested on trying to fast forward that with people. I think they've got to go on their own journey and you can put everything in front of them, but, it's up to them whether they decide to partake. And I think forcing it doesn't work. But, I think it's particularly those guys, once they hit 30, particularly in a sport like rugby, you only probably got 2 or 3 years left. They tend to be the guys that go, okay, well, I've really got to get moving. Now, the good news is we still have a bunch of young guys who are 21 buying homes, understanding that this doesn't last forever. But it's a difficult day. Like everyone else would say, oh, just do your well-being, just do your, PD stuff. You'll be sweet. Just develop a career. When you're fighting tooth and nail every week to play, it does get relegated in your list of priorities.
I have very rarely seen many people do it really well. I think a previous guest on the podcast, Dale Steyn, like an absolute legend of Test cricket, he has surfing, skateboarding, fishing. But fishing was a really big one, and he was always doing those. But those, again, I didn't ask him, but I'm going to assume they came from his childhood. And they played quite an interesting role in just how he approaches life. But not only that, the game, like you talk to him, he would talk very much about crossing the line, turning on his persona of a competitor. But then when he's off, he'll have a beer with you, chill. He's off fishing, skating, surfing. And there was that great balance. And there were guys that I played with that I think if anything they did, and anything I see now, the great ones, they really compartmentalize it. Even a rugby player I'd worked with recently, he was the first one I'd ever heard him talk about playing rugby as work, but he still loved it. He still loved it. He absolutely loved it. So he really enjoyed his work, but he said, I'm off to work. And I think it was just even that compartmentalizing of it meant that when he literally left the door to go to work, he switched it on. Then when he came home, he had his art, he had his family, had his friends, and his interests. And that for me was just he was a really young guy, and I was really impressed by it. But again, he's probably he's an outlier at the moment.
Yeah, and I think sometimes I think there's periods of your career where you have to lock in. It might not be I think balance probably isn't possible. I don't know, not complete balance. This is not a normal job. Like yesterday, we had the King's birthday weekend here in New Zealand, and the Monday was King's birthday weekend, and our team was still traveling. So I didn't go in, and I was like, I think this is the first public holiday I haven't worked in 7 years or 8 years. It's just a different work. Like you've got to accept that. You can't. You think about anyone who's done anything substantial. There is this little element of obsession and sacrifice that does look pretty unbalanced. What's the cost of that? Who knows? It's an individual question for everyone. But, I think there's times where you just have to lock in and go, listen, whether it's the next 12, 18, 24 months, I'm going to have to go to a whole nother level. I'm going to have to dedicate my way I never have before. And I still think we got to allow for that. I don't think we can get so the other way where we're now looking at professional sport and asking for a normalized, or a general population application of well-being. Well, you're dreaming, and I'm just in the middle of doing a little bit more research now with a colleague, and one of the things that we want to look at is well-being in elite sports. What is it? What is it not? And so right now, well-being is mostly discussed through the lens of a normal life, which I just think is just not that relevant. It's just not that relevant. These guys and girls don't live normal lives. It can be incredibly demanding and completely consuming and all of that. So how do we define well-being in that? And I know my mate Cody Royal's done some really good work around coaches' well-being and trying to see them much more balanced. And I love and appreciate his work. But I think, even he would admit there's a gnawing question around that, what is balance in this context? It's not, you don't go at 9 to 5. You don't, you're watching film or it's just, yeah. But that's why I reckon the love for it's so important, because if you love it, you'll do that. And it's not a burden. It's something you enjoy. And so even, that's the greatest part of the work that I get to do is there's not a day I don't want to go to work.
Yeah. I think that's so important. Your love for the game allows you to create the sacrifices that are needed, because those sacrifices, you have to make them. Otherwise everyone would just do it. And there is that line we have to draw where, if you're willing to do elite sport, there are sacrifices that you will take personally, physically, mentally, emotionally. There's all of this that comes along with it, but that's the beauty of it as well. It's just, I think you can do it well. You can arm yourself to deal with all of those challenges.
Yeah, well, I think talking about cricket, think of Steve Smith, who I don't know, but by all reports, he's pretty obsessed with his craft.
Yeah, knowing a few people that have played with him.
Yeah, I'm sure he'd be frustrated from time to time. And I think when we have seen him mentally under the pump, that was more about leadership than it was about batting. And so do you say to Steve Smith or, Kane Williamson was another example. There's so many stories here in New Zealand of him, shadow batting in his hotel room and people hearing the bat knocking at 3 a.m. But it wasn't, I think that's the difference between mastery and obsession. Is mastery is driven by joy, whereas obsession is driven by fear. And, I think it's quite an important thing to, so are you doing the work because you love it, or are you doing the work to avoid a failure? And that line's quite blurry.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what is what's
the failure-based stuff's not sustainable. That's my point, is if the obsession stuff, driven by fear and fear of failing, that's a tormenting mental process for someone to go through every week.
Yeah, I've heard of even cricketers as a good example. An ex-pro that I knew who, before his debut, he was up till at least 5, 6 in the morning fretting about the game. Now, Steve Smith might be up till 3 in the morning practicing, essentially, or shadow batting, but the guy fretting has expended so much emotional energy that the next day he describes it as sort of like a pretty blurry. So his legs didn't work very well, and that's the energy that he's lost. Steve Smith may not have lost because he's got the energy because he's so excited. He doesn't see anything as a threat. He's just seeing it as an opportunity, and that invigorates him rather than debilitates him. So it's a chat. It
only gets messy when a Steve Smith becomes the model, not an outlier.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, it's when you see kids I have a 14-year-old son who's cricket obsessed, but he would go for a net every day for 2 hours if my arm wouldn't fall off. And none of it's done out of fear. It's done out of absolute just love. Like, last the other day was the favorite thing in the world. He's like, I love batting. I just want to bat. I just want to bat and bat and bat and bat and bat. And I love that.
But and you got to keep that as well, though. When you're a pro, you got to keep that, because there are other external noises that come in. There's so much, as you know, in the professional sport, the game does turn from a pastime to a job, and then it's okay. That can I keep that passion, keep the why I'm doing this, and continue into it on a professional level?
No, I mean, even when I was working in cricket, and did quite a bit of work with Auckland Cricket, heaps of black caps in the team, and I remember watching one net session where both guys were in there for an hour afterwards, and one was getting peppered and smiling and loving it. The other one was searching. Yeah. So the work ethic was the same, but the motivation behind it was completely different.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So if your process when you sit down with an athlete, is there a framework, a way in which you work with them? How does that work for you?
Yes and no. There's a general framework, but it's very general because everyone's so different.
Yeah.
I would sort of use what I said before as like, are you delivering on what you're capable of? And the answer is always no. Okay, so there's a gap between capability and delivery. So what's in that gap? So that's sort of the thing that I'll explore, and then pretty much go off a needs analysis model after that. So, assess the need, prescribe an intervention or some tools, and then monitor progress. So that's why a skill-based approach to it is needed, because if you see it like a skill, then you train it like a skill. If you see it like, I've made some ridiculous examples over the years. It's like saying to an athlete, like, hey, like for you as a cricketer, you're batting real well right now, so no need to have a net. Like, we'd never say that, but hey, you're playing well right now, so no need to work on the mental side. It just doesn't make sense to me. But once again, we can go back and go, well, if we treat it like a skill, everything changes in the way that we do the work.
Talk to us about, I've heard you really talk about this, accountability, and the way you work is you place that accountability onto the athlete. Talk to us about having accountability on your mental game as an athlete. What does that look like, and how do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, accountability to me is another word for ownership. So, like, I don't want to hold you accountable at the end of the day. I want you to own your career. So, like, if I think of what's one characteristic that almost all the best have, it's ownership. So, like, they own their development, they own their performance, and then everyone around them is seen as a resource to support, rather than someone, having to drive them to own their career. And so I think once you establish ownership, which to me, the antithesis of ownership would be excuse making, give up sort of talk, like, oh, it's not worth it, or, constantly seeking affirmation through insecurity. So those sort of things are, once I see them sort of emerging, then what I want to try to do is empower the athlete to take some ownership over all the areas that are threatening their performance. And I suppose once that's in place, so, if the general concept of ownership is this is your career, not mine, I'm here as a resource, then you have to drive your development. So my job isn't to keep you accountable. My job is to support you as you take ownership over your career. Else, all you're doing is forcing people to do things that they're not going to do with integrity. And, I'd much rather have a group of athletes that drive things, and then you're almost waiting to catch up with them because they're so demanding of you, rather than having to chase them all the time to do work. So even at the start of the year, I say to them, listen, I'm not chasing anyone in the room for a one-on-one. I'm not messaging you for that. That's yours. But if you want help, I'll give you everything I've got. So that's sort of my approach. And then it's working with the athlete around, like, let's be honest, they'll more seek me out when they're not playing well.
Yeah,
which is like, I can accept that. Like, I'm not bothered by that. That's just what you do. But I think what's really important to recognize is that the other parts of your game, you don't wait till your underperformance emerges to take ownership over them. So why are you doing it in this area? And then, so my responsibility as a coach in those settings is to ensure that they have the right information and the right tools and the right support to work on that. So if they come to me and said, listen, I really want to work on it, and you have nothing for me, that's on me. That's completely on me. But if they know they have a resource and they know that the expertise that's in the room can help them and they choose not to, then listen, that's on them.
What about the athletes that potentially don't believe in it? How do you try to...
I don't care.
Are there ever, or I guess I think in my mind I'm probably thinking about senior players, but then younger players who are...
I have a policy, like I've shared it before, feed the hungry. I'm not trying to convince someone to eat.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
But I love the challenge of it. Like, I had someone during the Six Nations beginning of the campaign said, oh yeah, we've had 2 or 3 of you in the last number of years. We'll see how long you last. And I loved it. I was like, this excites me. Mm-hmm. And by the end of the Six Nations, he's one of my weekly one-on-ones every week boxing.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
But for an older player, like, I'm not trying to be facetious here or deliberately hostile about it. I just don't have enough time and energy to convince someone to work on something that's important. But I suppose with the older athletes who haven't, I had one the other day I spoke to, said, you got 3 years left in the career. Why don't we work on this stuff and make sure those 3 years end well? And he was up for that. So it's probably about how you reframe that. And if he had said, nah, I'm not interested, well, okay, sweet, I'll move on. There's 30 other people in the room that I've got to try and help throughout the period of a week. I barely have enough time to get to all of them. So I'm not going to run around trying to convince people that they should have an appetite. I just want to feed the people who are already hungry.
John Lewis, who is now the England women's head coach in cricket here in the UK, he's a former teammate of mine, been on the podcast. He described things like this. I remember he was a teammate of mine towards the latter part of his... Well, he was a teammate, then he became my coach. And he said to me, I remember as we were rooming together, we were talking around... He introduced me to yoga, and he introduced me to talking to a psychologist. Yeah. And I remember just his premise about all of it was like, you have all of these stones essentially put in front of you. Why would you not turn them all over and just take a look? And the worst thing that's going to happen is you just come back to where you are right now. And where you are right now is still a professional athlete, but you're sitting at your baseline of your potential right now. It goes back to what you said at the start, is can you walk away from your career having known that you tried to eke out every aspect of your potential and you tried your hardest to make that a reality and do...
I think there's a big difference between I don't know how to do this versus I don't want to do this.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, anyone who's curious, that's I don't remember, I can be quite direct. Being a New Zealander, sometimes we be a bit direct, but I remember speaking to a player last year, I've said, you're just not good enough to ignore this part of your game.
Yeah.
Like, you're actually not good enough to not be working on it. Like, if you're at the very top, I could understand maybe a bit of hesitancy, but you're actually not that good and you need help in this area.
How'd they take that?
Bit shocked, I think, initially, but then come back and were like, you're right, let's go for it. Because they knew it, I knew it. I knew it would land probably rough, but I knew that they'd come back. And if they didn't, then I'm saying, oh, listen, this is a great example of someone who's running away from stuff rather than running towards stuff that can help them get better.
Yeah, run towards it. That's a good point, an amazing point. So let's kind of move on to the recent paper that you've done. So it's all around integration of mental skills in teams. Yeah. Where did the sort of passion for that paper to come from, or where the idea of that paper come from?
Yeah, I shared on the webinar probably a couple of things. Like, the first was right back when I was beginning work. I was at a spring training in Phoenix, Arizona, and about 300 young men were on the minor league facility. this thing is minor and major leagues. And I said to the then manager at the time, how many of these guys make it? He said about 8% who get drafted playing the big leagues. And when you look out, they all look really good. They're all fit. Their skill set just seems immaculate, all of them.
Mm.
And I said, well, what's the difference? And they all look, and he said, the top 2 inches. And I said, what are we doing about that? And he's like, nothing. Just walked away. And I went, oh, wow. So here's something that we know is important, but we don't do anything about it. So that was first. And then secondly, was probably, I didn't really do much social media till probably 3 or 4 years ago. I just wasn't in a phase of my life with my kids and my family. But I was like, man, like this is something I got on LinkedIn and thought I'm just going to share my experiences and what I've done and learned over the years, and resonate with a hell of a lot of people. And then I started getting messages all the time of these really frustrated practitioners who are in a team and got hired and, you know, get a little bit of money here and there and nothing's working for them. And so those sort of 2 events go, it's too important of a subject to ignore, but we ignore it at our own peril because it's probably better to have no program than a poor program. So there's a fine line between that, because if you have a poor program, then it just reinforces the narrative that the stuff doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so between those two things, I've seen really good people not getting a good shot to, you know, like I was talking to a friend on the way home, driving home today, and I said, your talent can't outrun the system. Like, you're a talented coach, but you're never going to outrun the power of the system. The system, if it's set up for you to not have success, it doesn't matter how good you are. And so, you know, that was sort of, for me, watching all of these really outstanding coaches and practitioners perpetually frustrated at their inability to have the impact that they envisaged and not quite knowing why, but having these sneaking suspicions. So that was sort of the motivation behind the paper, is that, you know, I've watched this stuff grow and grow and grow over the years, and now see, as I said before, a normalization or an acceptance of the mental side. Like that's there. Like, you speak to I think every Major League Baseball team, every NFL, like every team now has someone. And yet, as the research sort of revealed, probably only 10 to 15% of those teams would have a program. And a program and a person are not the same thing. Completely different.
That's true. Very true. I mean, the numbers that straight away at the very early part of the study that kind of shocked me was that 100% of the participants said mental skills training is important, and then 11% said that it was in the strategy. So 89% it's not in the strategy.
So it's not important. Like, I don't care what they say. So it's the difference between perceived and actualized value. So the perception is we value the work, and in reality, or when we actualize that statement, the evidence of your value of the work is having a strategy for it to be delivered in an excellent way, because no other discipline of performance would you leave to chance, but yet this one you do. So, you know, the study sort of like hit me from two ends. Is one, there's not many teams doing stuff, but two is that they actually think they are.
Yeah.
Like, that was the part that probably got me the most, and they actually think they value it. And I would say, show me two things in a high performance environment that express value: is how much money you're dedicating to a piece of work, but that's not the true value. It's how much time. So all of these environments, I work in a time poor. So take time to have the mental stuff at the forefront of your preparation and performance. To me, that's a demonstration of value, not because you hired someone.
That great point. And I think just going on to some of one of the interesting obstacles that I think I found out of it was they wanted someone they spoke about people who had sporting experience or had an understanding of the environment.
Yeah.
That resonated, because I'm seeing that a lot as to why I get athletes who have someone in the organization that will still come talk to someone like me, is based off the fact that they say literally the start of the text messages as like, you've done it, you've been there. But then at the same time, I think there are so many great coaches out there who haven't had that experience, who haven't necessarily played or have been in the sport, but could really add value just through person they are, the way in which they go about it. So it just struck me, it's a really tough balance, isn't it? I think, because you can have some great coaches out there, but the perception is that you kind of need to have experience in a sporting environment. Yeah, I don't know. What do you have any thoughts on that?
I think you've got to understand this. Like, it's not, I wouldn't even put it in sporting. You've got to understand every environment you work in.
Yeah.
So, like, I work across multiple environments throughout a year, multiple sports, and then some multiple corporate work. And if you don't get what the environment is trying to accomplish, like what are the demands in the environment, what are the stresses in the environment, what are the expectations in the environment, and so for example, I look at sports in particular, my field. I go, well, there's 3 different kinds of sports that create 3 different mental pressures and mental demands, and they're not the same from sport to sport. And in fact, they're not even the same position to position. So for an example, like the endurance athletes, their training mentally is very, very different from a powerlifter, because what they have to do is mainly navigate through the conversation that they're having with themselves over 3, 4, 5, 6 hours at times, and maintain their focus where these voices are just hammering away at them. Then there's sports where you initiate the movement. So sports like golf or tennis or cricket, if you're a bowler, they offer a whole different set of challenges, because now you have space to think, and you're the one that begins the movement, that begins the game. And then you have reactive sports, which are, most of the evasive sports. You don't have time. It's very instinctual based. So your decision-making, your ability to read things, your ability to adapt and adjust, the ability to move to the next moment quickly. Well, that's all stuff you've got to train for that. And even if we want to go further, if you look at, say, a sport like rugby, where what are the mental demands on a 10 are not the same as the mental demands on a hooker or a prop. So, we don't train them physically the same way, and we certainly don't train them technically the same way. So why would we train them mentally the same way? And so I think you have to understand, don't think you have to have played to understand, but you have to have been close enough to where the play happens and close enough to the athletes who are in those moments and watching them and observing to them and talking to them to actually get a real clear picture of their demands. And I think the weakness, particularly in the mental side, is that we have a lot of people who come in and they have theories that they've learned somewhere along the line, and they try and cookie cutter them into an environment that they're not actually their needs. They're actually not really relevant to what that group or what the sport demands. And so someone says, oh, like when you work with a sport, how do you develop what you do with them? I said, it's easy. I just, what's the mental demands of the sport? What does a mentally proficient athlete do well in this sport, in this position? And if you can answer those 2 questions, then you've got a strategy.
Yeah. Or you've got an anchor, haven't you, to sort of bring the majority to and mold it individually how you see fit. Because
the moment you get generalized without relevancy, the players don't see that as that helpful. So for example, I'll give you an example, like with rugby, everybody knows that the fight flight thing's real, like it's a psych theory. But they don't need to know that. What they need to know is when you get on the field, if you go into fight mode, you're probably going to overplay. So I just call it overplaying. So you get ahead of yourself, try and solve problems by yourself. You go out of structure, you make bad decisions. But then you can underplay, which is you disappear, you stop talking, you go to the end of the line. It's just a reaction. It's a psychological reaction to stress. But they don't need to know all of the information about the psychological responses to stress. What they need to know is when they feel something, they can recognize it and know that they're in this sort of state and they can adjust.
So a lot of your work, I assume, is going to be on that initial relationship building, understanding that person, the environment, before you even go
I have a very clear process around that. So step 1 is connect with the person, not necessarily with the athlete. Find out who they are, what makes them tick. Number 2 is that connection enables trust. So then you starting to get into some good space once they trust you, and not that they trust you as a person, they trust your competency. And then once you've got connection and trust, then you can have impact or influence. So you can't have influence without those first two steps, not long-term influence. So there's a bit of work at the front end, but I think that's probably the most enjoyable part, because you get to discover what really makes these guys tick.
So your paper was a bit of a dive into understanding what's going on, why is it not happening? So what do you believe, where do we go from here to changing that 11% that say it's not in the strategy, to opening up the world to... I really liked your analogy of we train the body differently for each individual, but we also train the physical side. Where do we add in that time for the mental side?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, it's a long question. I could talk for hours about this stuff, because it's the stuff that most interests me. But I think, and I talked about this on the webinar, I've got a pretty simple process. Like when I work, so if a team comes in and says, we have nothing, where do we start? Well, firstly, we need to define what model you want. And there's so many different, and I'm not talking about academic models here, I'm talking about practical models. So all the way from you don't have a program to you have a minimalist approach, which is someone comes in during preseason. You have a deficit approach, which is you got someone in the building to fix underperforming athletes. You have the skill approach, which is we treat it like the other skills, sort of what I alluded to before, and we work at it through that lens. And then you have an integrated model, which is the mental side impacts how we coach, it impacts how we do our recruiting, it impacts how we select, it impacts our pathway, it just impacts everything. So you've got to define first what model you want for your team, and then after that, what framework needs to be created for the work to be delivered through, and then what content is important, then how we deliver it properly. So then I would go to finding the right person. So like right now, the worst thing that you can possibly do in this area for a team is let's go find someone. That someone comes in and then the first day someone says, oh, this is, Jimmy, he's our new sports cycle mental performance coach. He's going to be in 1.5 days a week. If you want to catch up, go see him. Like,
yeah.
I couldn't think of a worse way of trying to integrate the work. In fact, it's just going to destroy the work. So going back to that, then, there's so many, mate, we could go all night about what are the keys to integration. But I think one of the keys is understanding that you want to build a program that's strategic, not offer a reactionary service. And I think if you get that one concept, then you can build out a program and some strategy. So I don't know if that answers it, but I think you have to be incredibly strategic. And then outside of that, it's all relationships. So like, I know that my work success is determined by my alignment with the head coach. So because we have to be on the same page, have to be delivering the same messages, has to be reinforcing the right stuff. And so if I'm not aligned with a coach and I find that out either in the interview process or a few months into the work, I'm out.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, it's not worth it. Yeah.
It was a big part of the paper, wasn't it, that the key stakeholders have to be on board?
Yeah. And not just on board as in, we've done that, someone's here, but on board and driving the work. So I'm fortunate, like with our club and let's say Scotland Rugby and different teams that I work with, I get a session every single week, part of a session with the team. And it's just, we've done it, say, with the Chiefs for 3 or 4 years. It's just part of what we do.
Yeah. And I saw actually you sent out a newsletter this morning, well, my morning, your evening, and it mentioned about coaches having an understanding of psychology.
Yeah.
And that, I think this is where, do you think the coaches, it's better off if the coaches have done the work, but more importantly, just understand the work?
Oh, massively. Like I was thinking about it, before I sent that out this morning. And, like I had a colleague send me a really profound insight the other day who had just read the paper. And he said, the problem with a lot of the mental skills or psych stuff is that the head coach can do most of that himself.
Yeah.
Yourself, like motivation, clarity, confidence. That's part of their job. So you got to bring some value add somewhere along the line. And so that's why that relationship's so critical, because the ultimate shaper of the mindset of a team is not me, it's the head coach. And then my job's to provide the support and tools and reinforcement for that mindset to be present. And, you know, a lot of the teams that I work with, we have a mindset anchor that we'll use every single week. That is something that collectively we agree on from a mindset perspective is going to be important for us to do well so we can deliver our performance. So it's linked back to performance all the time.
Yeah, I think back to environments I've been in, that if the work itself is seen as put on the shelf, go get it when you need it. Whereas if there's a coach that's saying, no, I've done this, I believe, or I understand this is where it's going to work, the buy-in is almost 10x, just as a...
Yeah. And then it becomes really cool conversations like...
Yeah.
Like I had one head coach the other day, he's like, do you reckon we need a different mental approach to playoffs? What do we need to be aware of? And I'm like, what a great question from a coach. Just quite curious around, do we treat it like any other game, or do we acknowledge the situation? Like, just a really good question. That then enables him to shape his message for the week. So I see it much more as a partnership, but the main deliverer of the key messages should be the head coach. And then my job's just to come and reinforce that with some tools or some, like, you know, the way I describe it is, on the Monday, our coach will give the menu, then I provide the ingredients.
Yeah.
So here's the mindset anchor for the week. All right, Walshy, come Thursday, you got to tell us how we do that.
Yeah.
So that's the fun part.
I'm very cautious of time. Was there anything in the paper that surprised you?
Was there anything that surprised me? That's a great question. I suppose probably the only thing that surprised me was it didn't surprise me, but it reinforced the message that we are not doing a very good job at transitioning people from education into practice. So once again, like, it came through so many times, highly qualified, really, really nice person, I suppose. But when it came to the practical embedding of the work, wasn't able to do that. So I think that either goes back to what you said at the beginning, like, is it an experience thing? We just got to create more experiences, or is it an education and training thing where what they're actually teaching in applied psychology is not actually relevant to what happens when they get into one of these teams?
I having done a bit of reading in the literature over the last couple of years, one of the things I think I have seen, and this is just putting my athlete practical mind in, is that there are very few papers that actually, especially when there's an intervention done, where they almost lay out the steps of what happens. It's kind of just put in the procedure part in text, but people that can see how it works through the way it's displayed. There's a paper that was done in Australia around mental toughness, and it essentially outlined 8 weeks of mental skills training, but the table was brilliantly presented. And it's a go-to paper for a lot of people in mental toughness, because they outlined this 8-week strategy of how they implemented all of what they were talking about. And I kind of look at it and go, it's like giving someone a physical training program and saying, here's what's good for you. Here's sort of what you need to do. But they're not giving you on Monday we do this, Tuesday you do that, Wednesday, and not giving them that, and just going, all the best. And that for me, I think, is just been something I've seen in the literature, that it's almost what people are hungry for. They're hungry, like, okay, great, how do I actually do this? So maybe this is just off the top of my head, is that there are not enough examples for people that are going through the process of education and then going to being a practitioner, that they actually know how to put it into work, because they haven't seen anything, or as much as what they would like to. Yeah, that's just a thought off the top of my head, really.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to be said around just thinking, as you're saying, that is like, like all of the things that I would do on a daily basis within a team context, if you look through the literature, none of it would be in there.
Yeah.
So, that's a valid point, but I feel the conflicts, particularly for younger people, is like, well, how do I start gaining this experience? Like, I guess it's all right for me. I'm just about 47, been doing this for a long time, and have had so many of experiences. So when something comes up tomorrow, there's chances are that's come up in the last 20 years and I know what to do.
Yeah.
And someone asked the other day, like, how do you seem to know what to do? I was like, one, I've made a hell of a lot of mistakes. So, but I've been a good learner from those. But secondly, once your database of experience is built, you just it's just going and grabbing a file. Like, here's a file from 1999, or here's one from 2008 when we had this situation. And I've always, probably through my upbringing, I've always been told to be solution focused. Like, my mum was always really big on that. And so I think as a practitioner, I have to look straight away, if there's a problem, what's the answer? And I feel like some of these papers are not looking for answers. They're just looking for conclusions.
Mm.
And so if you make a conclusion, like, it's like being a critic, right? Like, it's easy to be a critic. It's harder to be a prophet. A critic can just point out what's going wrong. A prophet, for use of a better term, has to provide the way out for people. Like, okay, so this is happening. What do we do now? How do we respond to that? And I suppose, watching this work over the last number of years, there's still a lot of people who are really good at pointing out problems, but I don't know how good they are at offering solutions.
Well, that I think my theory around this is that because of that pointing out the problems, and you just touched on it, is that a lot of people in this space are worried about getting it wrong. Yeah. And that's the same, and athletes do the same thing, but through the fact that a lot of the research, it can be critique based, that if I put
but that's where you love that curiosity, though, don't you? Like,
totally.
Wayne Smith did an interview this week on TV, just got knighted, and he said over 50% of what I've tried to do hasn't worked.
Great.
And he's so relaxed about it, like, oh well, we gave it a shot, just didn't work, and but the stuff that has worked, I just keep on doing. So, I suppose, like, the fear of failure destroys creativity.
Mm.
And so you don't have innovation and creativity without risk and failure. And so it's just those who are willing to endure some of the pain of failure and getting it wrong and end up becoming the innovators. And the ones that can't tolerate getting it wrong or so fearful of the consequences of getting it wrong, they don't move anything. They just stay in their lane. And so, like, our relationship with failure, not just as athletes, but as people, I reckon determines our growth. Like, will we grow or will we not? I'll tell you this. I'll give you a simple answer. Are you willing to fail, or are you avoiding it at all costs? If you're willing to fail, then you'll grow. You'll be fine if you can learn. But if you're not going to fail, you're not going to grow.
Yeah, that's so true for not only just athletes, but for practitioners in this space. But look, Aaron, thank you so much for your time. Just before we wrap up here, one thing I always ask people just before we leave is there anything at the moment that you are recommending, whether it's a book, a film, a documentary, a quote that has inspired you that you're potentially recommending at the moment?
I'm just actually reading Anthony Bourdain's book.
Right.
Kitchen Confidential. It's pretty interesting. Yeah, really interesting, actually.
I mean, very incredibly interesting character.
Yeah, just like I just finished the last two. I finished that I enjoyed. I did Green Lights with Matthew McConaughey. That was and then I've just finished Dave Grohl's book.
All right, yeah.
Yeah, so I like music. So yeah, I'm not so probably much as I used to be into downloading Atomic Habits and listening to it for a week. Like, I love that stuff still, but I suppose, I don't know how you feel. As you get older, I get more interested in stories than I do in principles.
Totally. I think you can read so many self-development books, and what we've spoken about here is really just go put it into practice, learn, and that's what the stories are, right? The stories are people going out there, trying something, getting it wrong, and then that's sort of their guideline, and not necessarily to copycat it or copy it, but to do it in your own way, but just through being inspired by it, I think is the way.
And I mean, I guess I'm probably a little bit biased, very good friend, but I still think like Owen Eastwood's book, Belonging, is a brilliant book on teams. Probably the best book I've ever read on teams.
Right. Okay.
And it comes from a very different angle. So Owen's a Kiwi, lives in the Cotswolds, and works with Gareth Southgate on the culture of the English football team, and lots of other. He's worked all over the place, NATO, and he wrote a book called Belonging that became I think pretty much a bestseller in the UK, and it sort of just speaks deeply into our need to belong and understand that as a foundation of healthy teams. It's a brilliant book. So,
I mean, you're coming from New Zealand. It's something that is just ingrained in the way of life out there.
It's our culture. Yeah, I mean,
I've had James Kerr wrote Legacy on the podcast, and if anyone's read Legacy, you just get an understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, the concept that shines through Legacy and obviously through Belonging is whakapapa, which is, the idea that you don't exist by yourself. You're an unbroken chain from your ancestors into the future, and while the sun is shining on you, you've got an opportunity to do something.
Yeah, wow.
So your job is to respect those that have gone before you and honor them, and to prepare, a nice, clear road for those who are yet to come.
Amazing. I think we'll wrap it up there. That was some really great moments there to finish it on. Just really quickly, where's the best place for people to find
just
you?
On LinkedIn and Twitter. Yeah, LinkedIn and Twitter. So Aaron Walsh, I think you'll find me. It's been a really interesting and enjoying part to, I thought I'd throw this webinar out there and get, 50 or 100 people jump on, and there were 800 people ended up being registered, and it's like, holy heck, there is some hunger out here for this stuff.
That's the definite theme I'm seeing, is that there is hunger for it. And
I mean, I think since the webinar, I've had like 6 teams reach out and just go, we need help.
Wow.
So obviously can't do all that, so I need to train someone.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's a hard one to train, because it's not like I can give you a reference book and go learn this, and then you can help a team build a program. Like, so much of it is developed in the dirt. And going back to what you said, that's why I liked my journey, like practitioner first and then more academic later. And that's been really helpful for me, because, when I went back and did the academic stuff, and it probably sounds arrogant, but I found it quite easy, because all they want you to is talk about experiences. And when you're my age, you have a few, so you can draw on that as a reference point for your theories and your principles and your ideas. So that was just the right rhythm for me.
Yeah, amazing. But Aaron, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Really, really appreciate it. It's been a really brilliant episode. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.